New section, section 3. The withering away the law of value under socialism. And then it is not work as such which will disappear, but the surplus labor of the masses in the interest of and under the directives of the few. This is because, stresses Marx, quote, labor is the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence, and it is therefore independent of every form of that existence, or rather it is common to all forms of society in which human beings live, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Quote, in the sweat of thy brow shalt thou labor, was Jehovah's curse on Adam, and this is labor for Adam Smith, a curse. Quote, tranquility appears as the adequate state, is identical with, quote, freedom, and, quote, happiness. It seems quite far from Smith's mind that the individual, quote, in the individual's normal state of health, strength, activity, skill, facility, end quote, also needs a normal portion of work and of the suspension of tranquility. Footnote. Marx refers here to the following passage from Adam Smith, quote, equal quantities of labor at all times and places may be said to be of equal value to the laborer. In his ordinary state of health, strength, and spirits, in the ordinary degree of his skill and dexterity, he must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his liberty, and his happiness, end quote. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, end footnote. Continuing with the Marx quote, certainly labor obtains labor's measure from the outside, through the aim to be attained and the obstacles to be overcome in attaining that aim. But Smith has no inkling whatever that this overcoming of obstacles is in itself a liberating activity, and that further the external aims become stripped of the semblance of merely external natural urgencies, and become posited as aims which the individual himself posits. Hence as self-realization, objectification of the subject, hence real freedom, his action is precisely labor. Footnote. See Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3, quote, but free time, disposable time, is wealth itself, partly for the enjoyment of the product, partly for free activity which, unlike labor, is not dominated by the pressure of an extraneous purpose which must be fulfilled, and the fulfillment of which is regarded as a natural necessity or a social duty according to one's inclination, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3, end footnote. Back to the Marx quote. He is right, of course, yes, he is Adam Smith, that in labor's historic forms as slave labor, serf labor, and wage labor, labor always appears as repulsive, always as external force labor, and not labor, by contrast, as, quote, freedom and happiness, end quote, end quote. Marx continues, quote, this holds doubly for this contradictory labor, footnote, i.e. conditioned by a class antagonism, end footnote, back to the Marx quote, and relatedly for labor which has yet created the subjective and objective conditions, in which labor becomes attractive work, the individual's self-realization, which in no way means that it becomes mere fun, mere amusement, as Fourier, with Grisset-like naivety, conceives it. Really free working, e.g. composing, is at the same time precisely the most damned seriousness, the most intense exertion, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. And all those quotes, that big quote that I just read earlier, was also from the Grundrisse. And Marx comes later to speak of Fourier's conception, quote, Labor cannot become, as Fourier would like, ... free time, which is both idle time and time for higher activity, has naturally transformed its possessor into a different subject, and he then enters into the direct production process as this different subject. This process is then both discipline as regards the human being in the process of becoming, and at the same time practice, experimental science, materially creative and objectifying science, as regards the human being who has become, in whose head exists the accumulated knowledge of society." End quote. Grundrisse. Thus, productive human activity, work, will also be of decisive importance in socialist society. Of course, productive human activity, work, will undergo dramatic qualitative and quantitative changes. Productive human activity, work, will be distinguished in qualitative terms from the capitalist form of work, from which Smith so accurately described as a, quote, sacrifice of freedom and happiness, end quote, by the fact that, firstly, the worker will be turned into a conscious director of the production process. This is in italics, so I'm going to repeat this. The worker will be turned into a conscious director of the production process. Those whose task will be more and more confined to the simple supervision of the enormous machines and natural forces which operate in production. And secondly, through productive human activity's character as directly socialized communal work, the product of which will no longer confront the worker in the form of an alienating and dominating thing. Footnote. We read in the rough draft, Grundrisse, quote, "The emphasis comes to be placed not on the state of being objectified, but in the state of being alienated, dispossessed, sold, on the condition that the monstrous objective power which social labor itself erected opposite itself as one of its moments belongs not to the worker, but to the personified conditions of production, i.e. to capital, to the extent that, from the standpoint of capital and wage labor, the creation of the objective body of activity happens in antithesis to the immediate labor capacity. That this process of objectification in fact appears as a process of dispossession from the standpoint of capital. To that extent, this twisting and inversion is a real, not merely supposed one, existing merely in the imagination of the workers and the capitalists, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. But, quote, the bourgeois economists are so much cooped up within the notions belonging to a specific historic stage of social development that the necessity of the objectification of the powers of social labor appears to them as inseparable from the necessity of their alienation vis-a-vis living labor. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. In this way, labor under socialism, freed from the dross of the past, will lose the repulsive character of forced labor and become, quote, attractive work, end quote, in the sense adopted by Fourier and Owen. Footnote, quote, it is self-evident, end quote, says Marx in the theories, quote, that if labor time is reduced to a normal length, and furthermore, labor is no longer performed for someone else, but for myself, and at the same time, the social contradictions between master and men, etc., are abolished, labor time acquires a different free character. Labor time becomes real social labor, and finally the basis of disposable time, the labor of a man who has also disposable time, must be of a much higher quality than that of the beasts of burden, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3. This total transformation of work will express itself quantitatively in a fundamental reduction of working time and a consequent creation and extension of disposable free time. For although even socialist society will not be able to dispense with, quote, surplus labor altogether, it will be in a position, thanks to the full unfolding of its productive forces, to reduce the amount of work for individual members of society to a minimum. Footnote. It states in Capital Volume 1, page 667, quote, the abolition of the capitalist form of production would permit the reduction of the working day to the necessary labor time. But even in that case, the latter would expand to take up more of the day, and for two reasons. First, because the worker's conditions of life would improve and his aspirations become greater. And second, because a part of what is now surplus labor would then count as necessary labor, namely the labor that is necessary for the formation of a social fund for reserve and accumulation, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1, and footnote. When this has been accomplished, not only will the traditional division of labor, with its separation of people into, quote, manual and, quote, mental workers, fall to one side, but also the difference between work time and free time will lose its present-day antithetical character, since work time and free time will begin to resemble one another and complement each other. Footnote, quote, Marx, this is a quote from Marx, quote, it goes without saying, by the way, that direct labor time itself cannot remain in the abstract antithesis to free time in which it appears from the perspective of bourgeois economy, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. End footnote. Of course, even though labor has been transformed and reduced to a minimum, labor will have to be distributed among the various branches of production and individuals, and compared with the desired levels of production. This will require measurement by means of a unitary measure. Quote, on the basis of communal production, the determination of time remains, of course, essential. The less time the society requires to produce wheat, cattle, etc., the more time society wins for other production, material or mental. Just as in the case of an individual, the multiplicity of the individual's development, its enjoyment and its activity depend on the economization of time. Economy of time, to this all economy ultimately reduces itself. Society likewise has to distribute society's time correctly, in a purposeful way, in order to achieve a production adequate to society's overall needs. Footnote, quote, it is only where production is under the actual predetermined control of society that the latter establishes a relation between the volume of social labor time applied in producing definite articles and the volume of the social want to be satisfied by these articles. End quote. Marx. Capital Volume 3. End footnote. Just as the individual has to distribute, and this is still a quote from Marx, just as the individual has to distribute his time correctly in order to achieve knowledge in proper proportions or in order to satisfy the various demands on his activity, thus economy of time, along with the planned distribution of labor time among the various branches of production, remains the first economic law on the basis of communal production. Footnote. This, quote, economy of time, end quote, is looked at by Marx from another perspective. Quote, real economy, consists in saving labor time, but this saving identical with the development of the productive forces, hence in no way abstinence from consumption, but rather the development of power, of capabilities of production, and hence both of the capabilities as well as the means of consumption. The capability to consume is a condition of consumption, hence its primary means, and this capability is the development of an individual potential, a force of production. The saving of labor time is equal to an increase of free time, i.e. time for the full development of the individual, which in turn reacts back upon the productive power of labor itself, as itself the greatest productive power. From the standpoint of the direct production process, it can be regarded as the production of fixed capital, this fixed capital being man himself, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. End footnote. Back to the other quote from Marx that I'm still reading. It becomes law there to an even higher degree. What is law? The economy of time in the planned distribution of labor time. Economy of time becomes law in planned production to an even greater degree. However, this is essentially different from the measurement of exchange values, labor or products, by labor time, end quote. Marx. The passage in Capital 3, which is directed against Storch, should be understood in just this sense. Quote, secondly, after the abolition of the capitalist mode of production, but still retaining social production, the determination of value continues to prevail in the sense that the regulation of labor time and the distribution of social labor among the various production groups, ultimately the bookkeeping encompassing all this, become more essential than ever, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. This, incidentally, is probably the only passage in Marx which such economists as Joan Robinson and Leontiev can legitimately call on in order to impute to Marx the idea of the, quote, law of value under socialism, end quote. It is clearly sufficient for Joan Robinson, and I think it's Vasily Leontiev, I think that's his first name, that the phrase, quote, determination of value, end quote, occurs in this sentence. But Leontiev and Robinson could, with equal justification, pick out the scattered passages where Marx, quote, to talk the language of vulgar economy, end quote, speaks of, quote, capital in the ancient world, or even under socialism, and claim that for Marx, capital is not a historical but an eternal category. Parenthesis. See the following passage in Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3. Quote, labor time, even if exchange value is eliminated, always remains the creative substance of wealth and the measure of the cost of its production. End quote. End parenthesis. End footnote. 1 second. With this, we come to a question which has been raised very often. What of the operation of the law of value under socialism? It is, parenthesis, or was then, end parenthesis, generally known that value accounted for the founders of Marxism as an economic category which, quote, expressed the most extensive servitude of the producers to their own products, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. It is clear from this that they could not possibly have extended the operation of the law of value to a socialist (or a communist) society. On the contrary, any eternalization of the concept of value was always opposed as a petite bourgeois utopia. We read in the theories, quote, "Where labor is communal, the relations of men in their social production do not manifest themselves as, quote, values of, quote, things," end quote, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value. Quote, "The very necessity of first transforming individual products or activities into exchange value, into money, proves two things. One, that individuals now produce only for society and in society. Two, that production is not directly social. Is not, quote, the offspring of association, end quote, which distributes labor internally," end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Thus, in a community-producing society, quote, "labor is posited as general only through exchange. ... The mediation," end quote, "between the private labor of individuals," quote, "takes place through the exchange of commodities." I feel like this is a typo here. It says community-producing society, but I think it's supposed to say in a commodity-producing society. It says in a community, but I'm going to reread that sentence and say commodity. Thus, in a commodity-producing society, quote, "labor is posited as general. Labor is posited as general only through exchange. The mediation," end quote, "between the private labors of individuals," quote, "takes place through the exchange of commodities, through exchange value, and through money. All these, commodity, exchange of commodities, exchange value, and money, are expressions of one and the same relation," end quote. Marx. By contrast, under socialism, quote, "the labor of the individual is posited from the outset as social labor, ... He therefore has no particular product. His product is not an exchange value. The product does not first have to be transposed into a particular form in order to attain a general character for the individual. Instead of a division of labor, such as is necessarily created with the exchange of exchange values, there would take place an organization of labor, whose consequence would be the participation of the individual in communal consumption," end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Consequently, the measurement of labor by labor time would only be a means for social planning, regardless of how important it might otherwise appear for a socialist society, and would naturally have nothing in common with the, quote, "famed value," end quote, Engels, and the law of value. Footnote. Engels comments, quote, as long ago as 1844, I stated that the above-mentioned balancing of useful effect and expenditure of labor on making decisions concerning production was all that would be left in a communist society of the political economic concept of value," end quote. In Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, in parentheses, which is an early piece by Engels in like the 1844 period. Quote, "The scientific justification for this statement, however, can be seen, was made possible by Marx's Capital," end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. End footnote. From what has been said, it is clear that the measurement of work by labor time can fulfill two distinct functions in a socialist society. Firstly, in the production process itself, the measurement of work by labor time would serve to determine the amount of living labor required for the production of the various goods, so that labor could be used more economically. And secondly, this measurement can also be regarded as a means of distribution, by which individual producers would be allotted their shares in the social product destined for consumption. And of course, that would be like the I guess like the early would be like an early communism, whereas from each according to their ability to each according to their needs would be a higher communism. And as you might be saying, it's like even within capitalism, distribution does not necessarily take on that form. Say if you live in somewhere with like a free like health service, right? You're not like giving this for that in order to acquire access to health services. So there's no reason why in the early stages of communism, which would be the society after capitalism, that massive segments of the economy couldn't be immediately distributed on the basis of need as opposed to on the basis of work contributed to society. But that's just a side note from myself. Anyway, back to the text. It can, but it does not have to be regarded this way, for whether the future socialist society resorts to this method of distribution will clearly depend on the degree of the development of the social forces of production, i.e. primarily on, quote, how much there is to divide up, end quote. As we read in Capital, quote, the way this division is made will vary with the particular kind of social organization of production and the corresponding level of social development attained by the producers. We shall assume, but only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, end quote. Marx adds, quote, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. That the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time, end quote. And again, it says right there, only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities. Anyway, footnote. See Engels' letter to Conrad Schmidt on the 5th of August, 1890, quote, there has also been a discussion in the Volkstribune about the distribution of products in the future society, whether this will take place according to the amount of work done or otherwise. The question has been approached very, quote, materialistically, in opposition to certain idealistic phraseology about justice. But strangely enough, it has not struck anyone that, after all, the method of distribution essentially depends on how much there is to distribute, and that this must surely change with the progress of production and social organization, and that therefore the method of distribution will also change. But everyone who took part in the discussion described, quote, socialist society, not as something continuously changing and advancing, but as something stable and fixed once and for all, which must therefore also have a method of distribution fixed once and for all. All one can reasonably do, however, is 1. To try and discover the method of distribution to be used at the beginning, and 2. To try and find the general tendency of the further development. But about this I do not find a single word in the whole debate, end quote. Engels, letter to Conrad Schmidt, 5th of August, 1890. End footnote. End footnote. It is clear that Marx has in mind, it is clear that what Marx has in mind in this latter instance is a socialist society, quote, not as socialist society has developed on socialist society's own foundations, not as socialist society has developed on socialist society's own foundations, but on the contrary, just as socialist society emerges from capitalist society. Just as socialist society emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb socialist society emerges, end quote. This society has indeed expropriated the capitalists and transformed the means of production into communal property, the people's property. However, it is not yet capable of realizing the communist principle of distribution, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, end quote. Its mode of distribution is therefore still dominated by, quote, bourgeois right, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, which, quote, is a right of inequality in its content like every right. Which, quote, is a right of inequality in its content like every right, end quote. Footnote, see the significant commentaries on this in Lenin, The State and Revolution, and Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed, and footnote. Therefore, quote, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to society. What he has given to society is his individual quantum of labor, ... He receives a certificate from society that he has furnished so much labor, ... And with this certificate he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as costs the same amount of labor. End quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx lists these deductions as, quote, first, cover for replacement of the means of production used up. Secondly, additional portion for expansion of production. Thirdly, reserve or insurance funds to provide against accidents, dislocations caused by natural calamities, etc. End quote. Only the remainder of the product, therefore, is, quote, intended to serve as means of consumption, end quote. But, quote, before this is divided among the individuals, there has to be deducted from this means of consumption fund. First, the general cost of administration not belonging to production, ... Second, that which is intended for the common satisfaction of needs, such as schools, health services, etc. And see, like right there, that's what I'm talking about with like the degree to which you could immediately move away from distribution according to work, right? So, for instance, like schools and health services, maybe other sectors of the economy. Third, funds for those unable to work, ... Only now do we come to the, quote, distribution, ... Namely, to that part of the means of consumption which is divided among the individual producers of the cooperative society, end quote. Marx, Critique of the Gotha Program. End footnote. In other words, the worker receives mere certificates of labor, the sole purpose of which is to regulate social distribution according to the labor principle. However, there is no room for a law of value in such a society, because the form of production which exists here is completely different from commodity production, and because the regulation of production and distribution is not left to the blind play of the market, but is subject to the conscious control of society. It would, of course, be tempting to go into the question of the operation of the law of value in the Soviet Union and the so-called people's democracies in this connection. However, this subject goes beyond the framework of our immediate task. In addition, we do not think that we could say anything in this question which could measure up to the clarity and depth of the work of Evgeny Preobrazhensky, the most famous economist of the Russian Revolution, and also the leader, or the theoretical leader, of the left opposition in the Soviet Union. The main line of Preobrazhensky's argument consists in the view that any anti-capitalist transformation in an industrially backward country must take place under the conditions of a continuous struggle between the law of value, inherited from the capitalist past, and the diametrically opposed principle of socialist planning, and that the destiny of socialism depends on the outcome of this struggle. And if today numerous economists in the Soviet bloc elevate the law of value to the ranks of a socialist principle of distribution, this shows not only the extent of the theoretical gulf between these economists and Preobrazhensky and Preobrazhensky's contemporaries, but also how far social and economic relations in the Soviet Union have become separated from the original aims of the October Revolution of 1917. Let us summarize. The chief distinction between Marx's conception of socialism and that of Marx's predecessors is Marx's conception of socialism's scientific character, the fact that Marx uses the scientific understanding of the present social order as the basis for deriving the future socialist vision through an analysis of the capitalist relations of production. The object of the investigation is the same in both instances, namely modern capitalist society, except that in the one case the concern is with its present-day form, and in the other with the society of the future which grows out of it. We can therefore see that the economic interrelations studied by Marx must be understood largely as dialectical laws of development. In fact, they can only be grasped as such. This reveals the real meaning of the much discussed, quote, historicism, end quote, of Marx's critique. It is a method which seeks to examine both the conditions of existence and the historical barriers of capitalism. Footnote. We directed most of our attention to the rough draft, Grundrisse. This explains why we only occasionally mention the numerous statements and arguments about communist society in Capital, theories of surplus value, and anti-Dürer. End footnote. The socialist consequences which follow from this method, and which are aimed at the overthrow of capitalism, are therefore just as fundamental to Marx's system as a whole as is his actual study and critique of the economic categories in themselves. Footnote. Quote, but within bourgeois society, the society that rests on exchange value, there arise relations of circulation as well as of production which are so many minds to explode bourgeois society, a mass of antithetical forms of the social unity, whose antithetical character can never be abolished through quiet metamorphosis, end quote. Marx. Consequently, the enormous significance of the proletarian class struggle and the ideological processes which underlie the proletarian class struggle. Quote, the recognition of the products as its own, the judgment that its separation from the conditions of its realization is improper, forcibly imposed, is an enormous advance in awareness, and as much the knell to its doom as with the slave's awareness that he cannot be the property of another. With his consciousness of himself as a person, the existence of slavery becomes a merely artificial, vegetative existence and ceases to be able to prevail as the basis of production, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse, end footnote. And that's the end of the chapter from Roman Rosdolsky's The Making of Marx's Capital, Volume 2. And this section is titled The Historical Limits of the Law of Value, Marx on the Subject of Socialist Society. Thank you so much for listening.